On October 14th, 2025, Microsoft did something that no technology company in history had ever done at quite this scale. It did not announce a new product. It did not reveal a new feature. It flipped a switch that instantly transformed approximately 240 million perfectly functional, fully working personal computers into machines that would receive no more security updates, no more patches, no more protection against the vulnerabilities being discovered every single week in the operating system they were running. These were not broken computers. These were not old machines sitting in a closet gathering dust. These were PCs that people were using that very morning to write emails, run businesses, do schoolwork, play games, and communicate with their families. And then, at the stroke of a corporate calendar deadline, Microsoft declared them expired. Not because they had stopped working, not because they could not run software, but because they lacked a specific hardware chip called the Trusted Platform Module version 2.0, or because their processor predated an arbitrary generation cutoff that Microsoft had drawn to define Windows 11 compatibility. In doing so, Microsoft created the largest involuntary operating system migration event in the entire history of personal computing, and a significant and growing number of the people caught in that event looked at their options and chose Linux. To understand the full scale of what Microsoft actually did here, you need the numbers. Windows 10 was still the dominant Windows operating system in the months leading up to its end-of-life date. Stat counter data from mid-2025 showed Windows 10 commanding somewhere between 40 and 50% of active Windows web traffic. Canalys, one of the most credible analyst firms in the PC industry, estimated that 240 million PCs worldwide could not meet Windows 11's hardware requirements. And these were not ancient machines from a decade ago that had long since outlived any reasonable expectation of support. Many of them were 3, 4, or 5 years old. Laptops bought in 2020 or 2021 that ran perfectly well, handled everything their owners needed them to do every single day, but happened to lack a TPM 2.0 chip or used an Intel 7th generation processor that fell just outside Microsoft's supported CPU list. The barrier was not computing capability. It was a specific chip that Microsoft decided was necessary for Windows 11's security architecture, without offering any pathway for existing machines to meet that requirement through software or firmware updates alone. Microsoft's official guidance for users whose machines could not upgrade was delivered with a casualness that struck millions of people as completely tone-deaf given the scale of what the company was doing. The company's documentation stated plainly that if your PC is unable to upgrade to Windows 11, you can buy a new PC. That sentence, delivered as though replacing a fully functional computer, was a routine and reasonable consumer expectation, rather than a significant financial burden for hundreds of millions of households and small businesses, captured everything about how Microsoft characterized the situation publicly. Buy a new computer. Spend several $100s on hardware you do not need because your existing machine runs Windows 10 perfectly well, but happens to lack a specific security chip that Microsoft decided to make mandatory. This was the company's answer to what 240 million households and businesses should do. And for the millions of people who could not afford that answer, or who simply did not believe that a working machine should need replacing, the question became not whether to move on from Windows 10, but where to go instead. The e-waste dimension of what Microsoft created here is one of the most significant and least discussed consequences of the entire Windows 10 end-of-life decision. Canalys' estimate of 240 million incompatible PCs translates at an average device weight of around 3.5 pounds per machine to approximately 1.06 billion pounds of potential electronic waste. 1 billion pounds. The United Nations Research on Global E-Waste estimates that improper disposal of electronics releases toxic substances including mercury, lead, and lithium compounds into soil and water supplies, and that the externalized environmental and health costs from poor e-waste management reach approximately $78 billion annually worldwide. The Windows 10 deadline did not create all of that e-waste by itself, but it dramatically compressed the retirement timeline of hundreds of millions of devices that would otherwise have continued being used productively for additional years. And it did so, not because those devices could no longer perform their intended function, but purely because Microsoft decided to draw a hardware line that excluded them. October 14th, 2025 was also, as it happened, World E-Waste Day. The timing was not planned by Microsoft, but the irony was very widely noted. The community of people who had spent years working to reduce e-waste through open source software saw this moment coming and organized a real response. THE End of 10 project launched in the months before the deadline and built a simple, practical website offering step-by-step instructions for installing Linux on machines that could not upgrade to Windows 11. The project was not framed as anti-Microsoft. It was straightforwardly practical. Here's a machine that still works. Here's an operating system that runs on it. Here's how to make the transition. The project positioned Linux as the primary pathway for giving these computers a productive, extended life breath. Error, then sending them to recycling facilities or landfills. Several major Linux distributions timed their own releases and marketing campaigns directly to the Windows 10 deadline window, explicitly targeting users who were facing the upgrade or switch decision for the very first time. Zorin OS, a distribution specifically designed to be accessible to Windows migrants, saw download volumes that its maintainers described as completely unprecedented. Linux Mint, another distribution widely recommended for its Windows-like interface and ease of use, saw similar dramatic spikes in interest in downloads around the October 2025 deadline. The market share data tells you exactly what actually happened as a result of all of this. Linux desktop market share grew from approximately 2.746% in July 2022 to around 4.7% by 2025, representing growth of over 70% in just 3 years. That growth was not linear. The acceleration visible in the data aligns precisely with the major Windows-related pressure points: the Windows 11 hardware requirement announcement in 2021, the growing Copilot and AI integration backlash through 2024 and 2025, and the October 2025 end-of-life deadline itself. On Steam, Valve's gaming platform, Linux crossed the 3% barrier for the very first time in October 2025, hitting a milestone that the Linux gaming community had been anticipating for years, at exactly the moment that the Windows 10 deadline drove a measurable influx of new Linux users onto the platform. By March 2026, Linux gaming on Steam had reached 5.33%, reflecting both the new users arriving from Windows 10 and the continued growth of Valve's Steam Deck hardware, which runs Steam OS, a Linux-based operating system. Now here's the part of this story that matters for every Windows 11 user who is sitting there thinking this is someone else's problem and has nothing to do with them. Windows 10's end of life forced an immediate and unavoidable decision on people with incompatible hardware. But Microsoft's broader pattern of behavior during this entire period is creating a slower, more persistent pressure on Windows 11 users that is following exactly the same trajectory toward exactly the same destination. Consider what Windows 11 actually is in 2026. It is an operating system that embeds AI features users did not ask for and cannot permanently remove. It is an operating system that was described by its own CEO in internal emails as not really working, and which still has Copilot branded AI functions running under rename menus after a public promise to remove them. It is an operating system where a routine monthly security update corrupted SSDs in August 2025, triggered BitLocker lockouts in April 2026, and produced boot loops that Microsoft never formally acknowledged. It is an operating system that forces a Microsoft account connection during setup, syncs your settings to the cloud by default, assigns you an advertising identifier, tracks your app launches to personalized search results, and runs a content feed backed by a browser runtime you never opened. And it is an operating system whose hardware requirements are already being discussed in the context of the next version, Windows 12, which security researchers and industry observers widely expect to draw yet another hardware line, creating yet another wave of forced migrations on yet another generation of perfectly functional computers. The people who moved to Linux because of the Windows 10 deadline did not all do so out of technical enthusiasm or ideological commitment to open source software. Many of them did it because they had a machine that worked. They could not afford to replace it, and Linux was the practical answer to a practical problem. What they found when they got there has shaped the entire conversation about Linux adoption in 2026 in ways that go well beyond market share numbers. The most common theme running through migration stories from people who arrived at Linux via the Windows 10 deadline is surprise. Surprise that it worked as well as it did. Surprise that the learning curve was more manageable than they had expected. Surprise. See that their applications, LibreOffice for documents, Firefox for browsing, VLC for media playback, GIMP for image editing, were already there, already free, already working without any subscription or purchase required. Surprised that their machine, which had been running slowly and sluggishly under an RA-loaded Windows 10 installation, felt noticeably faster and more responsive under a Linux distribution that used less RAM at idle and had far fewer background processes quietly consuming system resources. And for many of them, that surprise turned into something they had not expected at all. Genuine preference. Not just tolerance for the new environment, but an actual preference for it over returning to Windows, even on machines that could have run Windows 11. The applications question is the most honest barrier still standing between Linux and true mass adoption, and it deserves direct acknowledgement rather than being glossed over or minimized. Adobe Creative Cloud, meaning Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects, and Illustrator, does not run natively on Linux. Microsoft Office, despite Linux having genuinely strong alternatives in LibreOffice and OnlyOffice, does not have a native Linux desktop client. Some enterprise software, specialized professional tools, and games that use certain anti-cheat systems either do not run on Linux at all or require configuration that not every user will find acceptable. If your workflow depends on Photoshop, you cannot currently replace it with a native Linux application and get the same experience. If your employer requires you to use specific Windows-only software, switching your primary machine to Linux may simply not be feasible regardless of how you feel about the direction Windows is heading. These are real limitations, and anyone presenting Linux as a perfect drop-in replacement for every Windows use case without honestly acknowledging them is not doing you any favors. What Valve's Proton compatibility layer has done for gaming, however, shows clearly what is possible when real sustained engineering effort is applied to the compatibility problem. Proton is a translation layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux without any modification to the game itself. When Valve first introduced Proton in 2018, skeptics argued it would always be a second-class gaming experience, slower, incompatible with most games, and fundamentally unreliable. By 2026, the ProtonDB community database tracks over 15,000 Windows games that run on Linux, with the majority rated as working out of the box or with only minimal configuration. Performance in many titles is comparable to Windows, and in some cases actually better because Proton includes specific optimizations that the native Windows version of those games simply does not have. Anti-cheat compatibility, which had been the last major blocker for many of the most popular online games, has continued improving steadily, with Valve working directly with game developers and anti-cheat providers to expand Linux support. The argument that serious gamers cannot meaningfully use Linux was true in 2020. It is considerably less true in 2026, and the trajectory points toward it becoming less true still with each passing year. The extended security updates program that Microsoft offered as a bridge between the October 2025 deadline and whatever comes next was designed as a temporary measure, not a permanent solution. Consumer ESU available for approximately $30 for the one-year period extending to October 2026, provided continued security patches for Windows 10, but no new features and no long-term future. For businesses, ESU pricing scaled significantly higher per device. The program acknowledged implicitly that the October 2025 deadline was too abrupt for many organizations to manage gracefully, but it did not change the fundamental situation in any meaningful way. Windows 10 is at the end of its supported life. The ESU deadline is itself now approaching or already passed. The users who bought time with ESU are now facing the exact same decision again with the clock expired. Buy new hardware to run Windows 11, stay on an unsupported operating system, and accept the growing security risk of doing so, or move to Linux. The choices have not changed. The urgency has only increased. The question that this entire moment in computing history is actually asking is one about trust and control. Microsoft built Windows into the default operating system for over 1 billion devices by making it accessible, familiar, and deeply integrated into the software ecosystem that businesses and consumers depended on. That dependency gave Microsoft enormous leverage to make decisions that users had no practical choice but to accept, because leaving was too difficult and too disruptive. The hardware requirements that locked 240 million machines out of Windows 11 were not made by asking users what they wanted. The Copilot integration that saturated the operating system was not made by asking users what they wanted. The mandatory Microsoft account during setup, the advertising identifier, the app launch tracking, the cloud synced settings, none of these were made by asking users what they wanted. They were made by a company that genuinely believed its users had nowhere else to go. The October 2025 deadline proved that millions of users did have somewhere else to go, and a significant number of them went there and stayed. Hardware manufacturers have also started sending very clear signals about where the Linux user base is heading. Framework, which makes modular and repairable laptops, popular among the Linux community, now officially supports Linux with documented driver compatibility and Linux-specific firmware updates. System 76 builds hardware specifically designed for Linux and has been steadily expanding its product lineup. Dell maintains its Developer Edition lineup, laptops, sold with Ubuntu pre-installed and certified for Linux compatibility. The hardware ecosystem supporting Linux in 2026 is meaningfully broader than it was 5 years ago, directly reflecting manufacturer recognition that the Linux user base is large enough and growing fast enough to be worth serving properly rather than as an afterthought. For the users still sitting on Windows 10 machines past the ESU deadline, or on Windows 11 and watching the direction the platform is heading with growing unease, The practical question is whether the Linux switch is actually feasible for their specific situation. The honest answer is that it depends on your use case in ways that make any blanket recommendation unreliable. If your daily computing involves web browsing, email, document editing, media playback, and casual gaming, which describes the majority of what most ordinary users actually do with a computer, Linux is genuinely a viable replacement in 2026 in a way it was not for most users 5 years ago. If your daily computing involves Adobe Creative Cloud or specific Windows-only enterprise software OOR gaming titles with anti-cheat systems still incompatible with Linux, then the practical barriers are real and should not be minimized, or dismissed. The right path for someone in that situation might be dual booting, which keeps Windows available for the applications that absolutely require it while using Linux as the primary environment for everything else. It might be running the specific Windows-only applications you need inside a virtual machine, or it might simply be honest acknowledgement that Linux is not the right fit for your specific workflow yet, while keeping an eye on whether the compatibility situation continues improving, which it consistently has been. What Microsoft created on October 14th, 2025 was not a Linux mandate in the literal sense. It was a pressure event, a moment, where the cost-benefit calculation of staying within the Windows ecosystem shifted dramatically enough that hundreds of millions of users seriously evaluated an option they had previously dismissed as too complicated or too technical for ordinary use. Some of them tried Linux and came back to Windows. Many stayed, and the ones who stayed are mainstream and more visible than the Linux desktop has ever been at any point in its history. That is how platforms shift. Not overnight, not all at once, but persistently, driven by real users having real experiences that they then share with the people around them. The Linux switch that Microsoft made mandatory for 240 million machines is still ongoing, and its effects on the operating system market are only just beginning to compound into something the industry has never seen before.